people requested me to do a review off of this infamous Ed, and Eddy episode, If It Smells Like an Ed, which one of the reviews that I remembered of this episode is from Gem Reviews, which I've watched multiple times, and when it comes to the point of view of thinking about this episode's purpose, with it being 22 minutes and it centers around the Eds being flamed, is still a good idea. However, the bad execution of them all really drags this episode down for being the most infamous of this show. The premise is that Jimmy, along with the Coverset kids, are celebrating their friendship with each other by making a huge heart while also singing a song that would be sung again at the end of Ed and Eddy Big Picture Show movie. But the Eds appeal to rain on people's parade, well, mainly Eddy himself, by giving Jimmy a wedgie. Soon after, there were 3 things that were happening when it comes to the Coverset kids. A paintbrush that was used to paint the heart is gone missing. Plank's mouth has been wiped off, and there was a hockey through the hearts that the kids made, and they blame those on Ed, and Eddy. With them getting framed, the Eds need to find different Coverset kids to see which foot is the foot that Ed found, which was part of the sidewalk, but unfortunately they found absolutely nothing. Nothing at all until the second half of this episode. This episode has been requested by some of my subscribers, mainly the fact that people just couldn't be able to find any credibility when it comes to this episode, despite the ideas that it had behind it. Mainly someone framing the Eds, but considering that the Eds aren't lying whatsoever, it kind of makes most of the characters, mainly the Coverset kids, mostly unlikable. And even though it may be debatable that they're familiar with Ed, Eddy, and Double D sometimes by doing some sneaky stuff when it comes to the scams, for me personally, the fact that they're not running a scam in this episode kind of shows that they're really innocent from the words of Double D himself. But if I'm going to express on who is the person who framed the Eds, then I'm just gonna say it right now, there's a reason onto why even Jimmy is one of the most unlikable characters from this show. Even though that he had justified reasons in order to frame the Eds, only one of them deserves to be framed, while the rest, not so much. Since this was during the time where Eddy is becoming more hateable and really mean, since that he's just trying to be like his brother, which he succeeded, it's just really unbelievable to think that Jimmy would still frame Double D and Ed, and I can guarantee you that if they actually gave Jimmy a wedgie while Eddy didn't, then I'm pretty sure that Jimmy would still frame Eddy regardless. The biggest problem is that Double D and Ed doesn't deserve to get framed, and whenever they try to defend themselves, the Coverset kids just don't listen to them. And what makes this episode difficult to enjoy when it comes to a flaming story is the fact that, with it being 22 minutes, it drags out way too long. Mainly when the characters are just trying to find whose footstep it is, and then in the second half they're just trying to find the trail of Juju's in order to find who is the person who framed them, only as it turns out they were in a trap due to the flamer leading them into a trap. And in the last season, where it showcased Jimmy hanging out with the Eds, only for the Eds to get punishment with Sarah being Jimmy's best friend, I really got the impression that they weren't intentionally making Jimmy likable, especially when he ended up hanging out with Double D in the 5th season. Because, to tell you the truth, this episode really showcased that Jimmy, despite his good intentions, doesn't automatically mean that he's in the right, because whenever I think of Jimmy in this episode, it really feels like that he wanted pure happiness, which, for me personally, everyone needs happiness, but when it comes to people like Eddy and the fact that he isn't fully aware of the fact that Eddy can instantly do something to him when it comes to his behavior, then I honestly don't understand why Jimmy would think that spreading happiness to all the Cul-de-sac kids is a good idea. I mean, it worked for Kevin, but Eddy, you really think that Eddy will be in the friendship spirit since that the only friends that he has aren't friends with the Cul-de-sac kids? That's where I don't take the friendship in this show seriously. Mainly the fact that even if the Cul-de-sac kids do hang out most of the time, that doesn't automatically mean that they're complete friends when it comes to them fighting with each other and how Sarah behaves. Believe me when I say this, if someone else was building a heart sculpture or some sort and Sarah wasn't in on it, like Jimmy is, then I can guarantee you that I would find it more of a difficult time to believe that Sarah is one of the Cul-de-sac's friends. That's just something that I just don't think that this whole friendship thing in this show works when it comes to these episodes. Even if it's impressive that Jimmy managed to set up the flaming against the Eds and convince the Cankles, but to tell you the truth, that doesn't automatically mean that it makes this episode good when it comes to Jimmy doing something that actually makes him better by himself, knowing full well that he still framed two Eds that don't deserve it, and he should have focused on the Ed who really deserves it the most. Sure, you can argue that it's not as bad as what Kevin did to Eddy in the following season when it comes to hide his middle name, but as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't excuse the fact that Jimmy is literally being portrayed as unlikable when it comes to these types of scenarios. Imagine if Sarah did all this. Well, she can instantly do it to the extremes, and yet at the same time, if Jimmy was by her side and thinking, I want to be like her because she knows how to teach these Eds a lesson. If you ask me, I'm pretty sure that Jimmy would still be really unlikable if he still didn't do any of the stuff that he did in this episode. That just shows of how much that Jimmy, well, he is thinking positive, well, he gets a little offended, even if it may be part of his character. The execution of the episode really makes it difficult to root for Jimmy, despite when he literally just includes Double D and Ed into all this. If you ask me, if Jimmy really found less bad in Ed and Double D, then he would have understand that any of the stuff that Ed and Double D did when it comes to the scams were mainly in the mindset of Eddy himself. Even if Double D is mostly responsible when it comes to making the scams due to his intelligence, I just felt like that after the many times that Jimmy went through involving the damages of the scams itself, he should probably reconsider on not going against the Eds every single time. Then again, that's mainly the structure of how this show works when it comes to the Eds making a scam, all the while the Cul-de-sac kids beat up the Eds. But let me just say this right now. If the show was focused on the Cul-de-sac kids, then maybe we'll have had a reason to root for Jimmy. But since the Eds are the main stars of the show, then I honestly found it difficult to go against the Eds, well, aside from Eddy, with them being framed by Jimmy. That just shows on to why that this episode is infamous when it comes to these decisions, especially since that Jimmy managed to mess with the Eds more by having the Cankos drag them to the trailer. And the only punishment that Jimmy gets is slipping on a banana peel, which, for all honestly, he did got punishment unlike Kevin in the following season, but at the same time, he had different scenarios where he instantly got hurt that were far more worse than this. I'm aware that Jimmy's character centers around him getting hurt all the time, but this was nowhere near as painful as the many times he got hurt. Believe me, just look at him getting hurt in the final episodes of Season 2 while Eddy is trying to get some attention. Just goes to show that he went through more worse than this. While this episode isn't worse than the other bad Ed, and Eddy episodes, it doesn't change the fact that the execution really drags this ideal down when it comes to framing the Eds. Believe me when I say this, for how that this episode is almost 22 years old when we head into July, there was nothing friendship related of what Jimmy and his friends were doing in the beginning of the episode. Even if they were mostly blaming the Eds for the wrong reasons, it doesn't change the fact that they were stupid. As far as I'm concerned, when you have the Confessec kids stupid for plot convenience, then you really know that you can't be able to side with the Confessec kids completely, especially when you realize that Eddy is more hateable than them. I'm giving this episode a 2.75 out of 10, and the next time we get back into the show, it'll be next month for Valentine's Half Month 6, where I talk about an episode involving the Kankos, which the last time I talked about them was in my Halloween Mania videos, and for me personally, I'm actually looking forward to talk about an episode from Season 4 that people would remember, but mainly overshadowed when it comes to the other Kankos episodes, because as far as I'm concerned, no one likes the Kankos, but at the same time, that doesn't automatically mean that the episode I'm going to be talking about next month won't be interesting, because for me personally, it is.